And if you want to start sharing in the chat, please introduce yourself with your name, pronouns, what RCC you're with, and your title so we can see who is here with us today. So thank you and welcome. And I think we can go ahead and get started. So again, welcome to our next California Advancing PREA office hours session, which is focused on building relationships with corrections. And for those of you who are joining us for the first time, these are 1-hour workshops on about a monthly basis around different PREA-related topics. And sometimes we do have RCCs co-facilitate with us, but today's session is just our Valor and JDI team. And again, if you haven't already, we do encourage you to utilize the chat feature throughout the workshop, and you can jump on mic to participate as well. And so again, if you haven't shared already in the chat, please go ahead and introduce yourself with your name, pronouns, what RCC you're with, and if you like your title as well, so we can see who is with us today. And then to introduce the JDI Valor team, my name's Layla Dost. I'm a program officer with JDI. I've been with JDI for a few months now, and prior to coming to JDI, I was a rape crisis center advocate. And I will pass it over to Edward and Jenica.
Hey, I'm Edward. I think I know most of you. It's good to be here. Yeah, we're talking today about building relationships, which, might be a little basic for some of you, but hopefully we'll get to answer your questions and, yeah, just provide information that's hopefully valuable.
And my name is Jenica Sinor. Pronouns are she, her, and hers. I'm a project coordinator here at Valor, working really closely with the JDI team. Yeah, and love seeing all these familiar faces. See a couple names I don't know. I'm glad to have you here. Thanks for joining us on this Tuesday afternoon.
All right, thanks, y'all. And some of you may already know, JDI is a health and human rights organization that seeks to end sexual abuse in all forms of detention. And JDI's core goals are to work together with corrections officials, rape crisis centers, and policymakers to make detention facilities safe, change public attitudes about sexual abuse behind bars, and ensure that survivors get the help that they need. And at JDI, it is our fundamental belief that when the government takes away someone's freedom, it takes on an absolute responsibility to protect that person's safety. No matter what crime someone has committed, rape is not part of the penalty. And I'll pass to Jenica.
Hey, Brenda, I'm going to have to step out real quick. Me llamaron de la escuela de mi son. I don't know if should I just end the meeting or should I just leave it running? Okay. Okay, pues. Thank you. Bye.
Let's see. We've got someone who've unmuted. Make sure we have our mics muted. Okay, there we go. Sorry about that. So hi, yeah, my name is Jenica. We're at Valor US. My apologies. Valor, most of y'all know Valor. But here we are committed to preventing and ending sexual violence by advancing equity and eradicating oppression. We are the state coalition in California supporting RCCs and other entities in ending sexual violence, and then we also do some national work across the nation. And next, yeah.
Thank you, Jenica. And a little bit on the California Advancing PREA overview. Now in its 7th year, the California Office of Emergency Services, CalOES, funded the California Advancing PREA project, allowing Valora and JDI to partner in offering support and guidance to California Rape Crisis Centers on how to build strong relationships with California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, or CDCR, county jails, and juvenile facility staff. We provide guidance on how to create sustainable agreements for the provision of victim services to survivors, although much progress has been made. We understand that there continues to be a gap and challenges in the services available to survivors behind bars. And then our objectives for today's session are to build confidence in working with corrections to ensure survivors are being provided with access to confidential emotional support services from a rape crisis center, discuss communication strategies to build relationships with corrections facility staff, and to empower advocates to provide a trauma-informed, survivor-centered perspective to corrections facility staff with the aim of creating culture change. And as always, we want to be sure to remind you all to take care of yourselves during and after this training, whether that means keeping your camera off, taking a break as needed, drinking water, or doing whatever you need to do for self-care. We definitely encourage you to do so. And again, please do feel free to utilize the chat and share any questions that you may have throughout the presentation. And I will pass over to Edward.
Thank you, Layla. Yeah, so we're going to talk about communicating with corrections. So some of this is really geared towards advocates who maybe have not started doing outreach to their local facility. So I recognize some of you in the chat and know that you've already gone past that point. So bear with us, we'll power through the slides. And then, you know, it's always a work in progress, this idea of building relationships with corrections. And there's always, you know, we could always do it better, right? We can always serve survivors better. And so building relationships is always a work in progress. So we'll hopefully have time at the end for any questions or any comments that we can address regardless of where you are. You can go to the next slide, Layla. All right, so what are some reasons that you might reach out to corrections? There's the MOU process, of course. That's the Memorandum of Understanding with the local facility. You may already have it in place. If not, that might be a reason why you'd be reaching out or why they'd be reaching out to you. Honestly, as part of the audit process, there's something called a PREA audit, where most facilities, every state facility is going to be audited every 3 years. And in order to be compliant, they need to have an MOU with their local rape crisis center. So if they don't have one in place, they might track you down and ask you to sign something. And so that's an opportunity to do some negotiating and figure out, okay, how are we going to get these services done? They'll come to you with something and you can come back to them with edits, and you know, it's a process. You might be reaching out in order to set up letter and hotline service. So for CDCR, again, there's already something established. There's that evidence code that you can put on letters that CDCR has agreed to, that makes that correspondence confidential. You can set up something similar with your local jails, and some local jails that we know of already do have that set up. You could also be setting up hotline services, so making sure that people can call your number. And then again, negotiating what that's going to look like. There's crisis services, so the forensic exams and accompaniment. Investigatory interviews is something that through our own work, anecdotally, we've been hearing is happening a lot more, and it's something that is included in the standards as an option. So for you to be present during the interviews after somebody's made a report. It's not always happening automatically, but it's something that you can advocate for and make yourself available for. There's also counseling, and that's the one-on-one counseling. You could be reaching out to set up groups. Again, now that we're going back to facilities. It sounds like people are trying to set up groups more, so that might be a reason that you're reaching out. And then there's also individual and systems advocacy. So if somebody reaches out to you and says, I need to find out what's going on with my report, or if you know about a pattern and you want to help make a change, then it might be helpful to have a contact that you can call and say, I've been hearing from several people that such and such is going on. If you've already made contact with somebody and built a relationship, right, and they trust you, they're just going to be more likely to actually act upon that. And so it's just helpful to start to build those relationships for that reason. All right, so to start, you'll want to identify your team. And so by that, what we mean is thinking internally, who's going to be your main point of contact. It just makes it easier if one person is consistent and like doing the outreach, because it might take a few tries and you might be sending a lot of emails. And so if one person is sort of in charge of making that contact, it would be helpful. It's identifying who's going to be providing the services. As a model, we believe that, it's best to have everybody trained on providing services to incarcerated survivors. But we know that, like, due to resources, funding, all of that, you might just need to decide, okay, these are going to be our PREA advocates. So it's just knowing upfront who's going to be doing what. At the facility, you'll want to identify the PREA coordinator and or the PREA compliance manager. They serve the same. So a PREA coordinator at the jail, they call it a PREA coordinator. At the prison, they call them PREA compliance managers. It's basically the person that's in charge of PREA. So, they're going to be your main point of contact in terms of setting up your services. You'll also want to know who's in charge of investigations, maybe know the lieutenants, the captains, the watch commanders. And I can't always keep it straight. Like what the hierarchy is, but if you can know who's who and like who the higher ups are, it's really helpful to just know kind of what the ranks are. Medical and mental health staff, again, sometimes knowing the mental health people can get you into the facility easier, so it's just kind of knowing what approach you want to take. And then the community resource managers are the ones who do programming. So if you're trying to set up groups, if you're trying to do like a RAC accredited program, for example, you'll likely reach out to the community resource manager, what they call the CRM. Yeah, so they do programming primarily, so your groups. And then we say California Advancing PREA Partners. That's us. If you have any questions, just reach out to us. Honestly, we'll help you figure it out. Because all of this, it's straightforward, but not easy. And I think sometimes just takes persistence. There's a lot of turnover. So if you find something online, a contact, it could be that like that was 3 people ago. And so it just takes a little bit of work to find the right contact. Okay, Layla, thank you. So in your initial discussions, you'll want to go over similarities and differences in your roles and responsibilities, and particularly around confidentiality. So the goal isn't necessarily to come to an agreement right away, but you'll want to clarify your role as a confidential victims advocate, and then over time, work to reach an agreement about what confidentiality will look like for incarcerated survivors. You'll want to be prepared to discuss why confidentiality is an essential part of your role, and also to answer questions that the facility staff might have about what you do and why you want to come in. If you can, we strongly encourage you to meet either at your agency or at the jail. We find that corrections are more in-person people rather than email. So just getting FaceTime can be really helpful. So taking turns, maybe going to meet them at the facility or having them come to your office Just seeing where each other works helps to gain additional understanding about where everybody's coming from. These conversations should also include sharing information about each other's policies and procedures. So you want to learn what happens, for example, when a report of sexual abuse occurs at the facility. So where did they take the survivor, and how did they separate people? Do the forensic exams take place at the facility or the hospital? Which hospital, and who's going to go? Also, how are they going to inform you when a report is made? You also want to know what support services are already available. And this is so that you can coordinate, again, with mental health can be really helpful. You'll want to learn who serves as the outside reporting option, and then also make sure that they understand that your hotline, for example, is not a reporting hotline, right? Because they'll conflate the two, or they'll ask you sometimes to be the third party reporting option, which we don't necessarily encourage or recommend. But we understand that it's kind of a case by case thing. But if you're not the reporting line, then you want to make that clear with them. It's also useful to learn what challenges the facility might be having with respect to sexual safety, and ultimately discuss your shared goal of eliminating sexual abuse. This will help you get a sense of how your program might be helpful in the future beyond just the individual services. And then last but not least, you'll want to discuss how the facility will work to coordinate access to and share information about the services that your agency is able to provide. So where are they going to put up posters? They should be by the phones. Can you include your outreach materials at intake? So if they're doing an intake process, can they inform people about your services? And then maybe that's an opportunity for them to hand out your brochures, business cards, that type of thing. Okay, so outreach will usually begin with a phone call or an email to someone at the facility. Or for CDCR facilities, you can contact us. Again, we're here to help you. So anytime you're stuck, just reach out to us. Also, some of you, I think, are in touch now with Rusty Hickathur. Never remember how to pronounce his name. Rusty, who's the statewide PREA coordinator, and he can also help you link up with the local rape crisis center. That's something that he's committed to doing. And he said that we can reach out to him on your behalf, or also you're welcome to reach out to him directly. He definitely wants to be able to facilitate those relationships. It might also be helpful to keep track of your outreach efforts. Again, it might take some time and several tries. So just keeping track of who you've emailed and what you've tried, so that you could refer back. And if you're reaching out to a stranger, or some random email that you found, it can be really helpful to use concise and direct communication. But keep it simple. The first email should really be no more than a few paragraphs, just explaining your agency's role and that you'd like to meet to discuss the possibility of setting up services as required by PREA. So, and if you can become familiar with PREA and the standards and be able to refer back to those, and really present yourself as someone who can be helpful to them, right? Because the PREA standards do require that corrections departments maintain those active MOUs, like I mentioned before. So honestly, they need you. And so you can always fall back on that. You can go to the next slide, Layla. Okay, and once you found a contact and had those initial meetings, you'll want to establish next steps. So it's including when you might meet next, or if you can set up a regular meeting, and also how you're going to communicate between meetings. So it could be, are they at the facility and not accessible by email all the time? Is it just easier to make a phone call? Like if I need you, hey, do I just pick up the phone? How do I reach you? A next step might also include developing a timeline for drafting that MOU, or if it's already in place, then you could familiarize yourself with it. You might also suggest doing like a cross training. So advocates can offer to train corrections partners and facility staff about trauma-informed care, for example, or you might be able to go and do a presentation about your services and how they're helpful, you know, and ultimately how by providing that trauma-informed care, facilities can be safer, right? If people are dealing with their trauma, then they're less likely to act out, and like that ultimately helps the safety and security of the facility. And so then you're speaking their language, right? So taking that opportunity to offer trainings and get on the same page. And then similarly, the jail can train advocates, train all of you about what it's like to work inside of the prisons, and offer you like a better understanding of how things operate at the jail. Lastly, you'll think about bringing the hospitals into the discussion. So maybe you'll want to go to a tour of the hospital. Maybe you can go together, see where the forensic exam will take place, and talk about any challenges that the setup might create and discuss on-site alternatives. So if you see the space, then you're able to advocate for, you know, a space that's as confidential as possible, because they could, when you take the opportunity to actually go to the hospital, for example, and you see the rooms where it's going to take place, and they tell you our officers are going to need to stand here, then you're able to negotiate. Again, it's a little bit of a negotiation, right? So you can say, hey, well, the door has a little window. Can you just stand outside the door so that you're not maybe listening to everything and you're still there, but there's a little more privacy. And that's the kind of thing that you're able to negotiate if you're on site together. Yeah, and then you go to the next slide, Layla. Similarly, you'll want to know your facility, right? So not just tour the hospital, but tour the facility. They really are an important starting point for partnerships between advocates and corrections officials. And it demonstrates that you're committed to it. So you'll request a tour for your leadership. It's helpful so that, you know, your leadership get familiar with the PREA compliance manager or the PREA coordinator so that you all know what's going on. You also want to bring along any advocates who are going to be providing those services. Could also be helpful to do it regularly. So if you can do it every year or twice a year, or if you hired a bunch of new people, you know, can you set up another tour? Because what's important is that the people who are providing services understand, like, it's different if you're talking to somebody on the phone and you have no idea like where they are or what their, you know, environment is. But if you see it in person, it just helps to understand kind of how you can be helpful. So knowing where the phones are, that kind of thing, knowing what the living situation is like. And if you go and you tour the facility, then you're also able to see the rooms where you might be able to provide that one-on-one counseling. And again, negotiate what's going to be the most confidential and what's going to be the most conducive to healing. Because corrections aren't always necessarily going to be thinking about the healing part, you know? So that's where you have to think like, okay, what can I advocate for? What can I negotiate? How can I best serve survivors who are here? And also, I think it's important that you ask to meet with people who are residents there, people who are incarcerated at the facility. So at CVCR, they have what's called an inmate advisory council, and every CDCR facility has one. They're people who have been selected or nominated, selected by the population, approved by administration, and they really represent the people who live there. We at JDI recently had a tour of CIM, California Institution for Men, down here in the Los Angeles area. We got to see the different housing units. We got to meet with, so each housing unit even had their own inmate advisory council. So we saw the layout, and then we talked with the inmate advisory councils, and I'm using inmate, sorry, because that's what they're called currently, IAC. And we found that at each housing unit, they were requesting different things. So one housing unit was a worker dorm, and so they work all day, and so daytime programming just wouldn't work. And they were requesting, programming at different hours. Whereas there was a medical unit where people weren't able to work necessarily, and so they're available during the day and they wanted a support group. So meeting with them and talking with people was really important in shaping what we were going to offer to the facility. And then we knew that there was, buy-in from the residents, and that there was a desire for certain types of programming. And then even once there, one of the guys that we talked to, we found out worked in the print shop, and he liked designing things. And so he's like, I could design your poster. We could print your posters here. I was like, oh, great. So let's go ahead and do that. And we wouldn't have known that if we didn't actually go for a tour and then spend the time talking with people. So ask. It might not always be possible, but it doesn't hurt to ask. Okay, and here we have a checklist. We'll provide this to you at the end, right, Jenica? But it's like just something that you can print off, goes over what you're going to bring. So actually you'll think about what can you wear. Usually you can't wear navy blue, for example, or khaki colors. So no jeans, closed-toe shoes, all of that. Usually you can find that on the website, but it's important to know, some of it might not be as straightforward as you would think. So you'll want to make sure that everybody is dressed appropriately, or they'll make you wear a weird jumpsuit. So you don't want that. You also, you need your ID. So this checklist goes over what you want to bring, also some things that you want to see. So again, thinking about where the phones are, what kinds of rooms are available, just getting a general sense of the layout. So who you want to meet, who you want to talk to, and then things to ask. So just some things that you want to keep front of mind as you go into these tours. And then again, I'll offer us as a resource. If you've done all this, you've done the initial outreach, you've had some meetings, you've had some discussions, you've set up a tour, kind of nervous about it. If you just want to talk it through, email any one of us, and we can, spend 10 minutes or whatever you need just to prep for the tour, so that you can make the most out of that time. Because I will say, I think the tours, and we say tour, it's really more like a site visit, is where these relationships and these understandings are formed, and are the basis of good programming at the facilities. Now hand it over to Jenica.
Thanks, Edward. Yeah, so and one of the reasons we keep saying, like, if you'd like to chat with us as your partners about this, if you'd like to talk about, how to go about that tour, or if you're nervous about it, is because each relationship with a correction facility is really, really different and really unique. And it takes a little bit of like assessing the room, assessing the land, not assessing the land, assessing the room, reading the room, and tailoring your responses and your approach to that. So, some tours, if it's been, if you've been communicating for a little while and you're setting up a tour or a partnership visit, a site visit, however you want to look at it, a tour might be a no-brainer for some facilities, and they're like, yeah, we do this every week for different people and it's no big deal. Or a different facility might be like, yeah, it's been a while since we've done a tour. Well, what do you want to see? And then you're needing to kind of come up with things and brainstorm things. And it might not be that they're in a place for you to ask a bunch of questions, for you to ask a bunch of like what they could perceive as invasive questions. Maybe it's just rapport building. It's for them to get a chance to know you a little bit too, and get to know like that you're not there to kind of shut them down or get them in trouble, even though, there's a lot. I mean, yeah, that you're not necessarily there to come shut them down. um, and for them to, put a face um to the name behind your agency, right? So building a little bit of that trust in their uh trust during your tour. So um yeah, so just want to kind of keep that in mind. And as we go through the next couple slides, this isn't meant to be like an end all be all, because relationships are so unique and are so different depending on where you're at. And that's where that one-on-one TA comes in, with Edward, Layla, and I, and our team, and being able to kind of cater that to y'all. And this information is kind of based on the calls that we've had with rape crisis centers over the past 2 years, and the past and things that we've heard, and based on our relationships that we've built with CDCR leadership. Edward mentioned Rusty Hickethier, who's the statewide PREA coordinator for CDCR specifically. I apologize, my cat just decided to jump on my desk right now. So this is where this information is kind of coming from, and we'll just go over some overarching themes. So, one, just corrections culture in general, it's a different culture from an RCC for a number of reasons. It can be really drastically different. The pace and priorities are quite a bit different. It's shift work. It's folks that are coming and working an early morning shift, a mid shift, an overnight shift. I feel like there's one that I'm missing there, but the pace is quite a bit different, especially for folks that are actually with incarcerated folks in their day-to-day. So not like your associate warden or your warden or your higher up leadership that might be behind a desk for a good amount of their time or in different meetings. For folks that are maybe your captains, lieutenants, sergeants that are a little bit more um, in the thick of it, so to speak. Folks are not often attached to their emails, or not checking their emails every hour or so, or checking their emails as often as we do. So having a little bit of patience when we're trying to reach out, and understanding that it might take a little bit, or understanding that getting someone on the phone is going to be a little bit easier because you know Captain so and so holds onto his cell phone like nobody's business, and you can call him at any time and he'll pick up. Maybe that's the better route. Let's see. From a corrections perspective, they're oftentimes focused on, they are focused on safety and order, and maintaining the safety of the facility, maintaining the control of the facility, making sure that doing their best in their minds, so to speak, to make sure that folks are like safe and orderly, and like in things are under control, drastically so. Whereas advocates, we're focused on, I don't want to say almost the opposite, but almost the opposite. We are zeroed in on autonomy and establishing agency and emotional support, and confidentiality is not peak, is vital to our work in the day-to-day. So we come from just really different perspectives, and it's important to be mindful of that, not in a way of like, oh my God, we're enemies and we're on opposite ends of the things, just in having some compassion for like when we're having some of these conversations and they may be a little bit tough, understanding where someone else might be coming from in that, and that it's not approaching the conversation with a little bit of tenderness could be really helpful, and a little bit of understanding can be really helpful. And working in corrections is pretty stressful too. It's a pretty stressful environment with very little support for your line staff, with very little support for someone who's going in to make their paycheck, support their family, and all of that. I'm not apologizing for that, and there's a whole system that's really, really problematic for a number of reasons, but their day-to-day can be really traumatic sometimes. So keeping that in mind too. And we have the privilege in agencies and RCCs to be able to talk a little bit more about the emotional side of our work, and corrections officers don't. So, knowing that the stress of that environment is gone unaddressed is helpful, at least for me. Keeping that in the very back of my mind. Keeping that in the back of my mind is helpful sometimes. Oh, I see a lot of love for my cat in the chat. Yeah, his name is Pluto. He's a great coworker, but man, does he have great timing. So the other thing is, folks might, or corrections folks might be a little bit more hypervigilant because of how stressful the environment is, because of the things that they do see day to day. We see this oftentimes. We hear from rape crisis centers all the time that, like, correction staff are trying to warn them about, like, how manipulative an inmate is going to be and how manipulative someone is going to be. Well, if someone has that viewpoint, they're also going to be watching, if you're going to leave group, they're likely going to be watching how you're interacting with the folks in your group, how, the incarcerated folks are interacting with you. What does that relationship look like? Is it a little over familiar? Is it a little over friendly? And so, as much as we know that we are maintaining those really strong boundaries, it's really important to be mindful about what interactions might look like in that over familiarity when you're in shared space with incarcerated folks, knowing that corrections officers could see that, and they have quite a bit of power to say, you know what, I don't think that, Jenica knows what she's doing anymore, and I'm really worried about her safety, X, Y, and Z. She shouldn't hold group here anymore. That hypervigilance can come out in a way that might be coming from a place of concern or coming from a place of wanting to control a situation, and just being really, really, really mindful of how your interactions may look. Not only for you and for, your services being impacted, but for what that incarcerated person might be receiving on, like, once you're gone. Like, is someone going to razz them about the conversation they had with me earlier? Oh, I saw you talking to the rape crisis lady for a long time, X, Y, and Z. Is someone going to be harassed about that? Is someone going to be retaliated against that? There's a lot that happens once we leave. We have the privilege to leave at the end of our group. We have the privilege to leave at the end of the day, and incarcerated folks don't. So just being really mindful of your presence when you are in the facility and what that could look like and what could be misconstrued. Okay, all right, off my soapbox a tiny bit. Next slide when you're ready, Layla. Another thing to really be mindful about is that correction staff will use different language than we will. Correction staff uses language that is often opposing something that we'll say. So, or often, is more harmful than we would like. So they'll use terms like offender or inmate, alleged assault, report, safety and security, mandated reporter, versus RCC staff will use a little bit softer language, a little bit more trauma-informed language, like incarcerated survivor, victim, or client, that really looks at, like, their experience as a whole, right? We'll use the word assault because, we're not in charge of investigating anything. We're not in charge of anything, so we're not going to put alleged on that, because that could really bruise the trust that we're trying to build with the client that we're working with. Support versus report. Our goal is the support. Our goal is supporting someone whether they want to file a report or not. Our goal is really leaning into making sure that survivors feel supported no matter what they choose. Healing and recovery, making sure that someone knows that we're there to help them with their healing and recovery. Of course, we're concerned about safety and all of that and security, but that's just a different, it's just a different term that we aren't going to be talking a whole lot about security. That's just not our role. Let's see, what else am I missing here? Okay, we can go to the next slide. Okay, so collaborating, a fruitful collaboration with corrections, a fruitful and positive and humble collaboration with corrections can be really beautiful and really beneficial. You know, we've seen really powerful things happen, right? When we have the right people in the right space and there's like just that perfect combination of folks. But when you spend a lot of time with folks, when you spend a lot of time with corrections folks, there's opportunities for enmeshment. And enmeshment is when we look at community programs and institutions and the boundaries that define each of those roles, each of those responsibilities and their values become blurred or like intertwined. So when things overlap a little bit more than maybe they should, it can be really hard to identify enmeshment, and it happens over time. And it can be a result of being really eager to collaborate and not want to lose that momentum. It can also be the result of, you know, every now and then, you know, allowing something to slide in the name of like picking your battles, or this was a one-off situation. I know that's not what they meant by that. Um, I, it, it's it happens over time and it's super gradual and it's natural, honestly, especially if you're working really closely with folks or you're building something that's really cool and you're both really excited about it. And both agencies are like on board. It's natural to like not want to quote unquote like make waves, right? There are power dynamics at play. So, like we mentioned earlier, if correction staffs want, you know, information around an investigation, or they are like viewing something in a certain way, like viewing your interaction in a certain way, um, you might feel a little bit of pressure to like share that information. Or if they've viewed an interaction in a certain way, they can just say like, I don't think, you know, Jenica should come and facilitate group for a couple of weeks. We need to just take a break. And they don't even have to tell you that. They can just say, you know, you can't come to the facility for a couple of weeks and go from there. Um, you know, they have the power to, you know, not allow you to do groups anymore. They have the power to not allow you to come and do one-on-one support. And even stuff that's not as like blatant as that, like they may not feel so inclined to call you for that forensic exam. They may not be. So if they've, you know, if there's a conflict between you two, if there's, you know, something, maybe you didn't share information when they wanted it, um, they may feel less inclined to call you for that investigatory interview. So, you know, we encourage folks to stand in your values. We encourage folks to approach, you know, those conversations, really leaning back on like the policies that you all discussed at the beginning of your relationship, or the policies. Sometimes it's helpful to like say like, hey, this is a VAWA thing. This is a confidentiality thing. Like our agency has our hands tied, but we can't say anything. Sometimes it's helpful to like place that, you know, that blame on like another entity. And correction sometimes gets that a little bit better than like, sorry, I can't share this information with you. But it's each relationship is so unique. So we definitely encourage you to check in with us. Do regular temp checks with your team. So that's with us, that's with your supervisors, that's with maybe even it's, you know, checking with someone in another department at your team, just because they're a little bit far removed from the situation. They have like an unbiased opinion, like okay, yeah, this looks like it's a little bit enmeshed, or this looks like it's a little bit there's some boundary crossing here. It really just depends. But having those regular check-ins with your team is really important. Okay, next slide. And some of this I think is actually a repeat from earlier in Edward's section, so I apologize about that. But just reiterating, wanting to connect with staff that are beyond the PREA compliance person, PREA compliance manager, or the compliance team. You know, some of the strongest relationships I had in my role as an advocate were with programs people, because the programs person was really excited about having, you know, groups held in their county jail, and she then could influence other people to, you know, open up doors for different services. And maybe that's the route that you have to go. Setting up regular contact, something that can look like setting up a regular meeting. If your relationship is rocky and it is, you know, it would be like they'd be dragging their feet to attend any kind of meeting like that. maybe it's setting up a 15-minute phone call every other month. Maybe it's, hey, how would you feel if I just called and checked in with you at the beginning of every month? So, you take on the labor of checking in with them. You take on that labor of, you know, putting that effort into the relationship. Maybe that's where you have to start. Um, or maybe, if it's really rocky, maybe you just have on your calendar reaching out to Sergeant so and so every month, and it's not even something that you're creating with them. Maybe your relationship isn't at that point yet. Um, and then utilizing opportunities to provide that informal TA. Are there opportunities for, you to plug some resources in? Are there opportunities for, you to drop some pamphlets off for the break room? Are there ways that, did a situation happen and it went okay, but it could have gone a lot better? Is there maybe a training that you can do a month after at a staff meeting? Um, is there an opportunity, Edward was talking about cross training earlier. We've had a lot of folks have success in inviting corrections to come and do a training for you. Of course, that's complicated, and we always want to meet with the folks that are training afterwards to kind of undo some of the information shared, maybe, or maybe provide a realistic aspect of what that could look like. But inviting corrections to a tour at your office. In my experience and in my role as an advocate, folks loved getting invited off campus. They loved an opportunity to like take a trip down the hill and go into town. You know, I have really enjoyed doing that. Get them lunch, make them feel a little bit special. It seems silly when you say it out loud, but corrections folks don't get invited to that stuff for a lot of reasons, frankly. But they don't get invited to that very often. Do you do a walk a mile? Do you do a yearly um fundraiser? Do you do is there some kind of event that you can invite staff to so that they can come and, be part of some of the fun stuff and some of the awareness building stuff? Um, is there something that you do for SAM all throughout your town and then you can include them too? How can you engage them in things that are proactive and in relationship building and not necessarily reactive when someone's been assaulted? You're trying to build these strong partnerships, this trust, this collaborative space. And I think oftentimes when we're working on building relationships with corrections, we're trying to get just the bare minimum, and that's super, super important. But inviting them to the other stuff, thinking about other ways that you can collaborate with them and bring them into the fold, bring them into your community. Invite them to your SART meetings. Do you have a regular SART meeting that happens? If they don't attend that, can they? Let's see, next slide when you're ready. Okay. And again, highlighting your services. So Edward talked about it a little bit earlier. But once you've identified, your allies, once you've identified your her name was Pam, the program manager, the programs person's name was Pam. Once you've identified your Pam at a facility that's going to open up all the doors for you, you want to think about how you want to frame what you're offering. When you're working in corrections, remind staff that your agency's work isn't just for folks that are incarcerated. It's for, the staff as well, by creating a space for folks to process trauma around sexual violence. You're hopefully lowering a little bit of that stress overall in the facility. Of course, that's a big ask, right? But you're taking some of that labor off of the staff by holding some of that trauma, right? By holding some of that space for folks to work through their trauma. Let's see. And then this is back to Edward.
I'll hop in, Jenica. Yeah, so all of this we say while also encouraging you to hold your plans lightly, right? Because we aren't going to know everything. So you can go in and you can make suggestions. But I think it's also important to ask corrections staff for their ideas, for their input. So what time makes most sense? There's things like, for example, when lunch is delivered. So you don't want to provide services at a time where people are going to miss their lunch because, you know, they're away from the dorm, they're getting services, they don't get their sack lunch. That you like, you know, that's annoying, and people will skip your services if they're hungry and stay to get their lunch, that kind of thing. So you want to ask staff like, hey, and what are the times that make most sense for us to hold a group? What are the slots that are available? And yeah, that's just the type of thing that they're going to know best. And so if you can think about it in a collaborative way, and sometimes honestly it's helpful. I always think my boss, when we used to travel all around California, like doing trainings, she used to say, you know, sometimes it's helpful if you get them to think that the idea is theirs. And that always stuck with me. So if you can like lead them to the idea and have them present it, then you're just like, yeah, that is such a good idea. Then they're like fully bought in, you know, so just bring them to it and let them present it. Um, Also, we want to be consistent and reliable. So if you say that you're going to do something, if you say that you're going to be there at a certain time, be there. And if once they see you regularly, they get to know your face, they see that like you know how things operate, then it just makes it so much easier. You know, like you kind of not that you become one of them, but like then they just know that you're part of the process with that consistency, and they see that you know how to handle yourself. Um, and then the last thing we say is that it's okay to be honest. So there might be things that you overhear um, that are problematic. You know, we all come from different backgrounds, have different opinions, different ways of viewing the world. Um, so you'll need to determine like, is this something where I feel like I need to push back on? So if there's a racist comment or sexist comment or transphobic or something, like, is this something that I should speak up on, or is this something that maybe I bring up at a later point? But always being strategic, right? And it's a like with law enforcement, who sometimes can be challenging to work with, it's similar. Um, it's okay to let them know how you feel, while remembering also that you're there to support survivors. So keeping that front of mind, because you don't want to lose access, right? And you want to be sure, you want to be the strongest advocate, and you want to work collaboratively, while also like holding on to your values. So it's just kind of keeping all of that in mind as you build these relationships. And I think we've got a few minutes for questions. I do kind of want to address what Marina brought up about data. You know, and I'm trying to think if there is something about the effectiveness of service. Well, nothing comes to mind in terms of like concrete data about, you know, bringing in support services and what kind of effect that has on a facility. Like I said in my message, I think we can rely on our expertise, you know, which is like helping people cope with their trauma, and like how, and there's plenty of data on that, right? And plenty of information that we can share about how dealing with that trauma um, just helps people have better outcomes. And if you like sort of play that tape out at the facility, you know, then something that looks like misbehaving is less likely to occur, because people have better coping skills and they're better able to address their needs and their traumas. So yeah, it's definitely helpful. And I think, again, we can just rely on what we know.
Well, and we can comparatively, like, it's not data, talk about, there are victim advocates that are embedded with law enforcement agencies. There are victim advocates that are part of the DA's office. There are victim advocates that are part of family justice centers, and that won't mean anything to a corrections officer, but there are other lean on the fact that, especially if you have other really successful relationships that are where staff have said it's been really helpful, that can be helpful as well, really specifically in your community.
Yeah, Kiki.
Um, I was wondering if I could share on
Yeah.
that topic. You know, now is a really great question. And I know that sometimes even with the corrections, they like numbers and graphs and like tangible like numbers, which you can see, right? But just kind of piggybacking off what you two have said, sometimes the data is in the live experience. So here's an example. And I just want to share it like those who have starting a rapport with their officers, sometimes it's about like kind of like revisiting those same officers that may have had the issue with those particular clients, and then asking like, oh, once I left that session, let's say it's a Friday, how did they do over the weekend? And with that lived experience or live experience, they'll start seeing and tracking in themselves with less codes being called when that advocate have left, if that makes sense. And so, and a quick example was I was leaving the facility and they stopped me and was like, hey, can you go see Jane Doe? And I was like, oh, in my head, I was like, that individual is on my coworker's caseload, but because I know that they know if he don't get seen, he's gonna pop a sprinkler. And so it was like it didn't even matter who the caseload was. It was like, hey, I know you're on your way out of the building, but could you go see him because we don't need him popping a sprinkler. And I just kind of really like that came from an officer that which makes us know that when we leave them not in crises, it kind of starts that tracker per word of mouth, and then they start sharing it with other officers amongst themselves, like, oh, we haven't heard from Jane Doe in 5 days, and they happen to look at the record and they see that we have seen that individual maybe the last 3 days. And so it's kind of like share that, like it's like a tracker in conversation, and maybe not necessarily on paper. And then another idea that I was thinking for those who want to kind of share the tracker is maybe start writing down, Jane, of course leaving their names out for identifying purposes, but like share the wins and notate that, so when it's time to present information to newer officers or trying to build a rapport, you can go to your folder, your information, and kind of share like here's in the last 6 months Jane Doe, if you will, and how how their behavior has the negative behaviors has lessened over the 5-6 months that I have now been going to this facility. And if you kind of start that, the advocates kind of start tracking it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it makes total sense. Thank you so much, Kiki. I love that. Yeah. Once you establish services and you're going regularly, then they'll start to see it because we know that it makes a difference. So thank you for sharing that, Kiki.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Sorry, I couldn't find my unmute button. I think, oh, Layla, am I closing this out or are you? I'm so sorry.
Oh no, I was just waiting if there were any other questions. Yeah, thank you so much, everyone. Thank you for being here and participating. There's a lot of answers to questions on the JDI and Valor websites, and the PREA Resource Center is a tool that we often turn to for information and insight as well. And you're welcome to reach out to any of us at any time with specific questions about this work, or to be connected with other agencies doing similar work as well, or for coaching, anything like that, you are welcome to contact us. And we'll also add this link in the chat. This webpage contains a bulk of the trainings that have been developed by JDI and Valor over the past years, which speaks specifically to honing in advocates' expertise around work in detention. And we also have a feedback survey. If you would take a couple moments to engage with that, that would be greatly appreciated. And thank you so much again for being here. And thank you, Jenica and Edward, for presenting.
And then we're also going to plug into the chat the feedback survey. Give me 1 second to get the link. And we'll send it out in the email blast as well. If you could fill it out, it'd be really helpful. It's helpful to know what's works, what's not working, what you loved, what you hated. Be brutal. Give us all the feedback, please. It's only a couple questions if you don't mind. But yes, thank you everyone so much. Really glad that we were able to get together today and go over this topic. All right, bye folks.